Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing the case of a young girl who never returned home from a trip with friends down to Ocean City, Maryland in celebration of Senior Week. Once her body was found and foul play appeared obvious, authorities had their sights set on a group of individuals from the very beginning. But as time has dragged on and those early leads seemed to go nowhere, the case received very little media coverage, and hardly any information about the investigation was released to the public. Now, 30 years later, there's still hope that advancements in DNA technology will help solve this mystery. Today's case is about the murder of Elva Poore. Elva Poore was born on January 9, 1975, to parents Wayne and Janice Poore. She grew up with her brother Robert, who was 6 years older than her, and the family resided in Chesapeake City, Maryland, which is described as a small historical town located in Cecil County. As of the 2020 census, the population of Chesapeake City, Maryland was barely over 700. Now, Elva's parents both worked and provided a normal home life for Elva and her brother, with Janice working for a local financial institution known as County Bank, and her father, on the other hand, worked at a horse breeding farm nearby. As Elva grew up and came into her own, her passions grew, and one thing she became particularly fond of was a horse of hers named Maid of Metal. She spent an abundance of time tending to the beautiful mare and adored the hours spent by the horse's side. Also, in case you're curious, I'm not entirely sure if Maid of Metal was housed at the same breeding facility Wayne worked at, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection between his employment and Elva's love of horses. Now, at the time our story begins in June of 1992, Elva Poore was 17 years old and a sophomore at Bohemia Manor High School, where she played for the school's field hockey team. I will say, I have seen it mentioned that Elva may have potentially dropped out of school during her sophomore year, so in 1992, but I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is, as I only found one article that mentioned it, but I thought it worth bringing up anyway. Also, around this same time, it appears as though Elva was going through your typical teenage rebellious phase and was spending her time with a rougher crowd, experimenting with drugs, and hanging with older boys. Even though she was feeling a bit defiant, that didn't take away from her super fun-loving and happy personality. She was incredibly personable, and making new friends was a breeze for Elva. Her parents did say that she was starting to come out of this teenage angst she was in the midst of and was becoming more responsible again and blooming into a self-sufficient young woman. Now, on Sunday, June 14th, 1992, Elva Poore was about to leave her home for a fun trip with friends, but before she headed out the door, she made sure to write a quick note to her parents to let them know where she'd be. Well, sort of. The note provided just enough information that her parents might not have known exactly where she was staying or who she was with, but definitely not detailed enough for them to find her exact location and potentially try and drag her back home. You see, that week, the week of June 14th, 92, was Senior Week, and a bunch of Elva's friends were planning to take a trip down to Ocean City, Maryland to celebrate. And Ocean City was like this beach resort type of town, and it honestly sounded to me like the type of place teens and early 20-somethings would go during spring break. Now, Elva had previously asked her parents if she could make this trip down to Ocean City, and from everything I've read about this case, it appears as though her parents told her no. I can only imagine that the reason they didn't want her going was, in part, what I told you previously about her rebelliousness, but also because she was only a sophomore, and all the kids she'd be hanging with down at the beach would be at least several years her senior.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I had friends even in like the early 2000s that went down to Ocean City, Maryland.
Really?
Yeah.
I had never heard of it before.
Either that or I'm confusing it with Atlantic City.
Both could be possible.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Another thing that kind of like popped into my head, because when you're given the background on these individuals that these stories are about, a lot of times they were going through a teen rebellious phase.
It's a common thing.
Right? And it made me think of, because we just watched it the other night, it made me think of Scream.
Yeah.
And like the like the model used in horror movies.
Yep.
And how, you need to be a virgin, don't have sex, don't say I'll be right back.
Yes,
stuff like
exactly.
that. And it just seems like this is one of those common things that happens in a lot of these tragedies where it's like, oh, this was a person of, this age and they were going through a rebellious phase.
Yep.
And then things kind of spiral out of control from there.
Yeah, and I think we all can kind of attest to this, that we've probably all had our own rebellious phase, and like we've all made dumb decisions when we were young teenagers. And like I think about that today, like the amount of car accidents I could have gotten in, or like just random things like being totally irresponsible.
I'm surprised I'm alive today.
Honestly, I say the same thing. So it's like, it's normal that kids do this, but if it were me doing these things at 17, my now almost 30-year-old self would be like, Brittany, what is wrong with you?
Right.
Like, that is not safe.
Yeah.
But like you have this like sense of nothing's ever going to happen to you.
Nowadays, all you think about are the bad things that could happen.
Exactly.
The older you get.
And I don't even just think about it today. Like, I think about the things that I did back when I was 16, 17. Like, Jesus, Brittany, you are lucky.
Right.
And it's just horrible that there are like these shitty people in the world that take advantage of those vulnerable young people who make poor decisions.
Right.
So back to Elva and her, wanting to leave and go on this trip, even though her parents said no. Elva being 17 and all her friends going somewhere where she wasn't allowed to go probably caused her a serious case of FOMO.
Did she stay back at all? 17-year-old sophomore seems
Her
old.
birthday's in January. So she had like a weird...
So they like held her back a year, essentially?
They must have, yeah. Probably didn't put her into kindergarten.
Mm-hmm. I'm like the reverse.
Yes.
I have a late December birthday.
Mm-hmm.
So I was younger than everybody in my grade, whereas if I had been held back a year before going into like elementary school and stuff, I would have been like the older person.
Yeah, I feel like the December, January birthdays are the ones where you can go either way. Like you can put them in earlier and they'll just be young, or you can wait a year and they'll be older.
Right.
So I think that's what was going on with Elva. And this is probably also why she was feeling this case of FOMO, because she's like, I'm close enough in age to all of these people,
Right.
You're probably assuming they're like 18, 19, maybe some 20-year-olds.
So as she's maturing, she's probably vibing better with the older crowd.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the ones that she's in class with as a sophomore.
Definitely. And just saying, I know for a fact, like, even though we didn't call it FOMO back in the 90s, like, it totally existed.
Oh, yeah,
no one
absolutely.
coined the term yet, though. But
yeah.
Nevertheless, Elva seemed to still have a grip on her rebellious spirit and planned to travel down to Ocean City anyway, and left that vague note for her parents to at least let them know she'd be away from home, but not give up any pertinent details.
I mean, I'm sure her parents could deduce where she was going.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I was just about to say, I'm 99.9% sure that Janice and Wayne had to have known where she was going once they saw the note. It's the one thing that Elva asked them permission to do recently, and they told her no.
Right, and she's leaving around that same time.
Yeah, exactly. So they had to have known, like, oh, she's going anyway. She's going to senior week to celebrate,
Right.
but, she didn't give enough details to say, this is who I'm going to be with, and this is where I'm going to be staying. So it's like her way of still, like, throwing in that rebelliousness to be like, nah, you can't know everything.
Right.
Yeah. Also, the full details of the note that Elva left for her parents have never been released publicly, so I'm not certain what it said specifically, but there are a couple of hints in Ann Manzer's reporting for the News Journal. In her piece, it states, quote, she was getting a ride with a girlfriend, she assured her parents. She had a place to stay, they shouldn't worry. She'd call home in a few days, end quote. So, sometime on Sunday, June 14th, Elva made the roughly 110-mile trek or 2-hour drive from her home in Chesapeake City, Maryland, down to Ocean City, Maryland. But she wasn't making this trip with a girlfriend like her note said. She was actually driving down there with 4 boys. Well, really, I should say men, because based on later reporting on this case, all 4 of the guys Elva drove down with were 21 or older, and were reportedly only just acquaintances of Elva's, not close friends, and all 4 of these guys were said to be from Chesapeake City.
It's kind of creepy to know that, like, these older guys are going to this senior week party. You know why they're going.
Oh, of course. They're going to go get wasted with everybody.
Yeah, they're going to get wasted with everybody, but they're probably looking to pick girls up and have sex. And
hook up with younger girls or whatever. Right. Yeah. But I will say, from what I can tell anyway, it seems like Elva may have just been kind of like using them for
as
a ride.
Way to get down there.
Yeah, rather than like planning to stay with them in Ocean City. But the 4 guys and Elva began the drive down to Ocean City on the 14th, and After a quick fishing detour, assumably planned by the guys, the 5 of them arrived to their destination. Now, as we continue to move forward, this story starts to become a bit muddled. There are some aspects to the timeline that are just not clear and have been reported differently throughout the years, and specifically has a lot to do with where Elva stayed, who she was with, and exactly what she did while she was down in Ocean City. So basically everything. I'm going to provide you with everything I know, but I just wanted to kind of preface this next part by advising that the details aren't all neatly put together in order of when they happened after Elva arrived in Ocean City. So, for starters, there were 2 different places that Elva could have stayed that are mentioned in reporting on this case. One being the Admiral Motel and the other, the Ocean City Lodge. The 2 accommodations were, and actually still are because they're both still open today, a 0.1 mile distance from each other, which equates to under a 1-minute drive or roughly 3 to 5 minute walk. John, I'll show you a map of the distance between the 2 motels and you can see just how close they are. And for everyone listening, a visual will be on our socials and our website.
So I'm already assuming that this is probably like an area that's a strip with a bunch of motels, hotels, places for people to stay because they're going down to Ocean City for like a getaway.
Yes, exactly. So it's also like you've got like a boardwalk and you have like multiple motels and places to eat and all these other things. So,
all right, yeah, it's kind of as I suspected because you also have, obviously you have the Admiral and the Ocean City Lodge, but then just in that general area you have Jocelyn's Manor Rentals, Bungalow 8, Surf Villa,
the Blue Wave
Paradise
Inn.
Plaza Inn.
Yeah.
So
it's like a ton of different places to stay, but regardless of like which one she actually stayed at and all of that, they're all so close in proximity. We're assuming that all these things happened either at either of these places or within this general vicinity.
Right. The only benefit of narrowing down which one it actually was is if we need to talk to employees, people that may have saw her there.
Yep, exactly. Now, from what I've gathered, it appears as though the 4 men Elva was driving down to Ocean City with were planning on staying at the Admiral Motel, and Elva's girlfriends that she was going to meet up with once she arrived there were staying at the Ocean City Lodge. And it seems to me that Elva's plan was to head there to the Ocean City Lodge to stay with her girlfriends for the next few nights. I'm not 100% certain on this fact, but it appears to be the most accurate account based on the little information that's been released in this case. So, between Sunday night when Elva arrived in Ocean City and Monday night, the 15th, I really have no idea what she did. But the first thing that was reported regarding what she was seen doing and where she was seen was that in the evening or early nighttime hours of Monday, June 15th, Elva was supposedly spotted arguing with someone. However, it's unclear who this person was that she was seen in this heated discussion with. I've only ever seen them reported as, quote, another person. Then, later on, Elva may have been at the Ocean City Lodge, the place where her girlfriends were supposed to be staying. And then something happened while she was there. I don't exactly know what, but whoever she was with at this motel was actually asked to leave the premises. And more specifically, the Delaware State Police's website says that they were asked to leave due to, quote, excessive noise. So I'm not sure if they means Elva and her girlfriends, Elva and these guys she drove down with, or some other variation of these people.
I assume it's probably whoever was renting the room and anybody that was in it at the time.
More than likely.
Yeah, if it was being used as like a place to party. You got all these young kids, getting hammered in this hotel or motel room.
Yeah.
Probably disturbing everybody else around them.
But I also don't know how many girlfriends were there, where the 4 guys were. Were they back at the Admiral? Were 1 or 2 of them over at the Ocean City Lodge? Did rowdiness ensue and everyone got crazy or what? I don't really know exactly who was involved in whatever incident took place.
Right. So I would assume that, again, I assume.
Yeah.
But generally when a bunch of people are going down to a place to party, you have a designated party room.
Yeah.
That's what I imagine probably happened here. There were a bunch of people staying in various locations in the area. This room at the Ocean City Lodge happened to be the party room. It got a little out of hand, and then they asked whoever was renting the room, they said, hey, you got to go, broke the party up, and then just kicked everybody out.
Yeah, definitely. The good thing is, though, even if they were all kicked out, there's 75 other options for them around to be able to rent.
Right,
so
exactly.
So this same night, well, technically the next morning, so now the early morning hours of Tuesday, June 16th, a friend saw Elva walking along the boardwalk. If I had to guess, I think maybe the rowdiness in the hotel may have prompted Elva to leave, and start walking along the boardwalk, maybe to blow off steam, maybe to try and walk back to the other motel. I'm not sure. And just to note, the boardwalk is only a couple of blocks from both of the motels I've mentioned, so it wasn't too far from where she was staying. But either way, it's later reported that she was seen around 3 a.m. on the boardwalk, and that sighting of her was supposedly again with someone else. And that someone else was allegedly one of the guys she drove down to Ocean City with. And it's been said that Elva and the man she was with at 3 a.m. on the boardwalk were arguing. And this is just yet another one of those confusing aspects to this case, because there were reports that Elva was seen arguing with someone earlier in the evening, but then there are others stating that she was arguing with one of these men she traveled down to Ocean City with much later on in the night. For all I know, one or both are true. She could have argued with someone twice. She could have had a spat with more than one person, or really any variation of those two. I don't really know who it was, which one's most accurate, if they both happened, you know?
I'm guessing that it was probably the same guy twice.
Yeah, if that's the case, like if she actually was for sure arguing both times, it's got to be the same person.
You would assume so. I'm sure they built some type of relationship as they're driving down.
Yeah.
And then maybe he wanted to make some type of, physical advance towards her. She said no earlier in the night, went to the party, then the party got broken up. Everybody had to leave. Then he approaches her again, so she's like walking the boardwalk trying to get away from him. Arguing again, maybe he's trying to get her back to her room or something like that.
Yeah. So who knows? That's one thing that's like never been revealed, is what the argument was about, exactly who the arguments were with, or anything like that. So another reason why I say this whole aspect to things is confusing is because it's also discussed in a more recent Newark Post article on this case that Elva was actually seen again in the very early morning hours of the 16th back at the Admiral, the motel the guys were staying at. I don't know if she was seen there before or after she was seen on the boardwalk, but if she's supposedly arguing with one of these guys, then why is she going back to the Admiral?
If you believe that it was after the argument, maybe she finally caved and said, fine, I'll go back with you. Or if it was before, maybe she was convinced to go back there, and maybe some type of physical advance was attempted there, and that's why she stormed out, and maybe that's why there was another argument on the boardwalk. Yeah,
that would make sense. Or it could have just been like, maybe she caved because now she doesn't have anywhere to stay because everyone was kicked out of the Ocean City Lodge.
Yeah, and if there was some type of falling out with her friends, who knows if that's the case? Like, how was she going to get back home after?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good question.
Right, if these guys were the way she got down, and she was banking on, driving back with her friends, but maybe there was a fallout with the friends or argument with the friends or whatever.
Yep.
Who knows what that dynamic is like?
Yeah, it's definitely confusing. Now, from here, there are a couple of other miscellaneous things that I wanted to mention, but they don't quite fit into the timeline of what Elva was last seen doing. I mean, obviously they fit, but I have no idea when they fit into it all. So first, one thing I found particularly interesting was that I guess two of the men that Elva had driven down with had apparently left Ocean City to head back home to Chesapeake City that night, so the Monday night. The same night, Elva was supposedly seen on the boardwalk arguing with one of these guys. It's unclear which of the two men went back home, though, and if this information is accurate, that definitely dwindles down the list of who Elva may have potentially been last seen talking to early Tuesday morning.
So if they're saying that they left Monday night, is it like actually Monday night, or is like, I mean, some people may say that, 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning is Monday night.
Yeah, so that's the confusing part, because all of these things are happening, probably past 8 p.m. through until the following morning, so someone can see it as, okay, this is Monday night, others might see it as Tuesday morning, so who knows, maybe they were pissed off and they left at 3 a.m.
Right, and that's why I'm wondering, could this have been what the argument was over?
Maybe, yeah.
Earlier in the night, he's like, hey, we're leaving, like, you gotta go.
Yep.
They stay a little longer for whatever reason, and then later on at like 3 o'clock on the boardwalk, he's like, hey, we're leaving now. We're not staying any longer. If you don't come with us, it's whatever. Maybe it was an argument like that.
Yeah, but then why are only two of the guys leaving? And then what are the other two doing? How are they getting home? Because they all drove in the same car, at least from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, as we've learned through our own lives and as we've learned through other stories that we've covered, people around that age don't necessarily do what's right. They do like whatever emotions drive them to do at the time.
Yeah, and they're very like impulsive in the moment.
Right, so those two guys could have left because, the party got broken up, or they could have left for whatever reason, and as much as it sucks that they were now, leaving two of their other friends behind,
Mm-hmm.
the other friends could have been like, no, I don't want to leave yet. And they're like, yeah, well, whatever, we're leaving.
Yeah.
And just left them behind. So
That's totally possible.
yeah, it's strange that they split up.
Mm-hmm.
Strange that we don't know what the argument was about.
I mean, there's a lot of questions with this one.
Yeah, there's a ton of questions.
Already, I feel like I have like half a page
Yeah.
of questions. So, also, another thing I wanted to bring up is that there was a comment in the Newark Post article that I just mentioned a few minutes ago regarding a couple of things Elva did when she arrived in Ocean City and when she was said to be last seen in the early morning hours of Tuesday the 16th. But I don't know where either of these things fit. So, the article states, quote, "The girlfriend said Elva might have stayed in a separate room with the two boys, although Elva didn't have any money with her. According to police, Elva and one of the boys stayed in a baseball field dugout at least one of the nights," end quote. So this comment, first of all, appears to contradict the idea of Elva potentially staying with her girlfriends at the Ocean City Lodge. And honestly, I have a couple questions and thoughts and comments regarding this. So, one, she didn't have anything with her from what I understand. She had no money, no wallet, no ID, and then she's supposedly just last seen walking along the boardwalk. So first of all, where was she going? What was she planning to do? If she's kicked out of the Ocean City Lodge, was she planning to walk back to the Admiral and stay there instead? I really don't know. And then you have to think, too, if she's supposedly staying in this dugout or in this other room, she's only been there one night.
Right.
So what other options does that leave?
I don't know.
It's very confusing, right?
Yeah, especially because none of these accounts seem to be confirmed through multiple outlets. It's like you have different reporting in all these different articles.
Yeah, so it's like in the early days, there was like barely anything reported at all. And the information that was released was like little tidbits here and there. And then you have an article from a few years later that contradicts that. And then you have another article from even later that is sort of like one thing, but like also different in this other aspect. So it's like, what is the most accurate? Had things been completely like confused like for police in the beginning? Did they not really know? Were things released that weren't true, or they weren't sure of exactly what happened and they were just, you know, the media was spewing the information that they knew at that point? I don't really know, but all of it could mean something. None of it could mean something. So I don't know, but it's like, I can't not tell you about all the different things that have been stated. So
it's just a whirlwind of a lot of random facts or hearsay here and there. All we know is that she went down with these four guys, and then once she gets there, it's like, who knows what's true?
Yeah, muddled. Yeah. So freaking muddled. Also, John, I want to go back to what you were just mentioning before about that party, how you think you would have thought that there would have been a party and that's why they would have gotten kicked out.
Yeah.
So obviously that's more than likely the first thing that comes to mind for anybody that hears that. But here's something that's weird and that contradicts it. So it was stated in an article or two that there was a party taking place at the Ocean City Lodge that Monday night. But supposedly, Elva never showed up to it. So that just in and of itself does not make any sense to me. How could there have been this party? Everyone's getting kicked out. She's then seen on the boardwalk, but supposedly she never attended the party?
I don't think there was anything that's been said so far that, you know, deemed it as fact that she had shown up to the party.
Yeah.
It seems as though she went down there with no plans whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what they all were doing. It was just like, we're going to go and we're going to celebrate.
Well, I get that, but like other people clearly made reservations or they brought money to stay places and stuff. She just went down there with these guys, had no money with her, was just flying by the seat of her pants. I mean, she could have gotten down there and her girlfriends were like, yo, you can't stay here. Like, we already have 4 people staying in this room. It's a one bed. We got people staying on the floor or whatever. I don't know. There's like so many gaps in the story so far that you don't know which way to go with it.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of gaps, unfortunately. But I think we should keep moving forward because we're just going to have so many questions as we keep going. So let's get a little more info under our belts. So around 8 a.m. the following day, Wednesday, June 17th, 1992, roughly 29 to 30 hours after Elva was last seen, because she was last seen at 3 a.m. on the boardwalk. No further sightings of her after that. So you have to assume something happened, she went missing. So at this point, 2 men were driving along Route 13 in Odessa, Delaware, 2 hours north of Ocean City, Maryland, when something on the side of the road near the guardrail caught their eye. The men pulled over on the northbound side of Route 13 to inspect what they'd just seen, and as the two walked closer to the area just beyond the guardrail, they discovered a girl's body. It was stated that the location where the two men stopped off and found the body was just north of Odessa, near the Droyer Creek Bridge off of Marl Pit Road. And the teenage girl was found wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and shoes, but there was no identification on her to identify who she was. After the two men discovered the girl, they immediately began trying to flag down anyone that was driving by that would hopefully stop to help them figure out what to do, and thankfully they were pretty dang lucky because the person they were able to get to stop was an off-duty police officer that was literally on his way into work in Odessa, Delaware, the same town where this body had been discovered.
Talk about lucky.
Seriously, what are the odds? Other than the cop taking that route to work every single day. And
I know, but these guys stumbling on the body.
At this
right
time.
At that time, and then trying to flag somebody down, just
Yep, exactly.
Perfect circumstances.
Also, I was thinking this is just such a dumb thing, but it was reported that it was like right around 8 a.m. And I'm thinking about 8 to 4 shifts. I'm like, well,
yeah.
Was he late already? This guy?
Maybe, who knows? He's
stopping off at 8:10 to help these guys,
Yeah,
but.
Yeah.
Now, after police arrived on scene, the body was brought in for an autopsy to be completed in the next day or so, and investigators got to work to try and identify the teenage girl. What I'm unable to figure out, though, is how authorities were able to identify her so quickly. The same day her body was discovered, authorities got in touch with the Poore family, as they believed the girl found along Route 13 in Odessa was Elva Poore. Now, according to Ann Manzer's reporting for the News Journal, that day, Wednesday, June 17, 1992, 2 detectives with the Delaware State Police made their way to the county bank location where Janice Poore worked to alert her of the news that her daughter had been found deceased. The officers told Janice of the horrible news and also advised her that she or someone in her family would have to make a trip down to the medical examiner's office to identify the body found to confirm, for sure, that it was Elva. After Janice and Wayne arrived to the Wilmington ME's office to identify the body found, they confirmed that it was their daughter. Over the next few days, her family struggled immensely with the news of Elva's death, and when reporters attempted to conduct interviews or obtain comments from the Poore family, they declined. What they were going through was just too difficult for them to deal with, and they couldn't bear the thought of discussing what had happened with the media at that point. However, a family friend did speak to the press and stated, quote, "Everybody is in kind of a daze. I'm in a complete daze. It's not sinking in or something. I just can't grasp it," end quote. And 4 days after her body was found, Elva Poore was put to rest on June 21st, 1992. Moving forward, I want to kind of discuss the investigation in 5 key categories. John and I talked about this, and it seems like it'll make the investigation portion of our episodes a little more linear. The main reason for this is because a lot of times on these lesser known and less reported on cases, a lot of information comes out way later on, and I feel like that info is getting to John's and your ears later than it should. So this is how we're going to structure this piece to each episode moving forward. But of course, each case is different, so it could fluctuate a little bit, but how we've split it up should cover the basics for each investigation. So there are 5 categories that we've broken the investigation down into, and they are as follows. First, the scene. In this particular case, that would be where Elva's body was found. Second, any information regarding physical evidence or any evidence at all that was gathered at the scene, so those two kind of go hand in hand. Third, the autopsy results, if applicable, which they are in this case. Fourth, people of interest or suspects that made their way onto police's radar and any information on them and discussions authorities had with those people. And lastly, fifth will be a miscellaneous category, which will be for things that don't necessarily fit neatly into any of the other categories. This can include things like clarification on the timeline, certain things investigators uncovered, tips or leads that may have come in, etc. So let's begin with the scene. First and foremost, authorities didn't really find much of anything at the scene outside of what I've already told you. We know that they found Elva on the side of US Route 13, fully clothed with no identification on her. Authorities did determine from the very beginning that her death was considered suspicious, and we'll discuss more info on that as we get to the autopsy. It was also believed by investigators that Elva could have potentially been killed in another location, and her body later left on the side of Route 13. Now, we'll move on to evidence found and kind of lumping that in with the autopsy results as well. First of all, based on what I've gathered on this case, it does appear that authorities were able to find physical evidence which came from both Elva's body and her clothing. I don't know exactly what type of DNA was taken, but based on information we'll discuss a bit later, I do believe the DNA may have been semen, as it's reported that there was semen found on Elva's clothing. But I am not sure if there were any other types of DNA found and collected. Now, that's all the information I have regarding evidence found at the scene or things investigators may have gleaned from what the scene looked like. But one thing I do want to mention is that you have to think, if Elva had in fact been killed somewhere else, the information they were able to get from the dump site was likely lacking. John, do you have any questions or comments regarding what I've told you so far?
I guess the only one that I would have right now, well, two, I guess. From the autopsy, were they able to tell if she was sexually assaulted?
We're going to dive into that in just a second.
And then the other would be manner of death.
Yep, okay. We'll get into all of that with the autopsy results. So after Elva's autopsy was completed, the ME determined that she had wounds on her face and she'd been hit in the head, but it's unclear what type of object was used to hit her. There's also a lack of detail regarding if her facial and head injuries were caused by the same object. The ME was able to determine her cause of death, though, which was manual strangulation as well as that head wound. Elva's exact cause of death, as reported in the Newark Post, was, quote, asphyxiation due to manual strangulation and blunt trauma to the head, end quote. Also, according to this same Newark Post piece, it's believed by authorities that Elva wasn't manually strangled in a way that might have instantly come to your mind, like with someone's hands around her neck. Authorities are thinking more along the lines of the perpetrator having used his forearm to kill her.
So kind of like a rear naked choke.
It's interesting you say that, because I thought something completely opposite. Okay. I would have thought, and I know this feels like a little disturbing to talk about, but to push your forearm into somebody's throat on top of them versus behind them. Okay. I guess it could go either way, though.
Yeah, I guess so. If they're saying forearm, yours may be closer to what happened than like a rear naked choke.
Well, I wonder, like, if whoever did this was thinking about, like, leaving hand marks, and you can more than likely determine, like, the size of somebody's hands to say, okay, this was a female that killed her because the hands were significantly smaller, or it was like a larger male because, you know, the hand marks are large. But when it comes to a forearm, how are you going to determine that?
Yeah,
you know?
It's difficult to determine that. I'm also thinking, too, like if it was a man that was her killer and they used all their weight on top of her and just pushed down with their forearm. And if he's a lot larger than her.
I mean, I know I would, like, even just looking at the difference between the two of us, there would be no way that I would be able to struggle out of that. I am not strong enough.
Yeah, so I think that you could be accurate with thinking that, you know, somebody's on top of her using their forearm. If a rear naked choke is done the right way, you're probably not going to leave a forearm mark necessarily because it's a blood choke. It's not necessarily a asphyxiation type choke.
Okay, so then would that not be accurate then? Because it says it was asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. I don't know.
It's not, because asphyxiation is taking away your breath.
Yeah. What is a blood choke?
A blood choke, it just stops the blood from going to your brain.
Oh, Jesus. That's horrifying. Also, according to a News Journal article, quote, an autopsy found faint marks on her wrists and ankles, as if she had been held down for a time, end quote. And a detail that seemed to be a little fuzzy early on, but does appear to have been confirmed later, is that Elva had been sexually assaulted, hence the DNA found and the semen discovered on her clothing. Elva also apparently had drugs in her system when she was killed, but I could only verify this information with one source, so it's yet another piece to the puzzle that I'm not totally sure on, but if it is in fact true, the substance said to be found in her system was cocaine.
Do you get, like, Teresa Corley vibes?
Absolutely. I absolutely did.
4 men. You know, the girl goes to a party.
Driving in a car with these guys.
Own, gets picked up, sexually assaulted.
Yep.
Very strange.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know. I get nervous in, like, any situation, but, like, that specifically, one girl with 4 men that are at least 4+ years older than her, it just gave me an instant pit in my stomach. Like, this is a dumb decision I probably would have made myself at 17. But, like, thinking back now, like, if I had a kid, I would be like, don't you fucking do it. Right. Like, that is not good. That is not a good idea.
I wonder if Robert, her brother, knew these guys that she went down there with.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because he's 6 years older. If they're 21, maybe 22, 23.
Yeah, he
right
totally could have. And you have to think, too, you've got a tiny town.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if everyone knew everyone.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, let's now dive into the people of interest or suspects portion of the investigation. Over time, authorities appeared to have worked through several theories and had at least one suspect on their radar from what appears to be pretty early on. And obviously, one of the big theories investigators were working with had to do with those 4 boys that Elva drove down to Ocean City with. Conversely, though, investigators couldn't rule out the potential that Elva met with a stranger. For all they knew and all we know, maybe she attempted to hitchhike home after that argument she had on the boardwalk, and a stranger with nefarious plans picked her up. But let's begin with the 4 boys theory, or the idea that any of the 4, 1, 2, 3, or all of them, were involved. From the start, investigators clearly had their sights set on the boys. I think that makes perfect sense for them to have considered them as persons of interest. In regards to Elva's parents' thoughts on the guy's potential involvement, Wayne Poore, Elva's father, told the News Journal in 1994, quote, "There's a cloud of suspicion over them. If I were them, I'd want to clear it up," end quote. Which I think is a totally valid comment to make. Of course there's this cloud of suspicion. That's literally exactly how I felt when I first started looking into the case. These 4 guys came to mind as persons of interest from the very beginning, before I even knew the details of the case.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you have 4 older guys driving this girl down, potentially hanging out with her once they get down there. There's claims of her being seen with at least one of these men arguing, maybe once, maybe twice throughout the night. It's like
they're
of course going to be your first person you look into.
Yeah, they're partying, there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's all the things that make for a potentially very bad situation. Like, they're going to be looked at. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
Now, over time, authorities spoke to as many people as they could, obviously including the 4 guys, as well as others who were spending senior week in Ocean City. However, it appears as though some people, whether they were down in Ocean City or back home in Chesapeake City, have refused to talk. And, I mean, you can find that to be a little sus, but maybe some people just didn't feel comfortable. But to go along with that, according to a piece in the News Journal, quote, "Some have taken lie detector tests or volunteered blood samples, while others have been less cooperative," end quote. And it seems as though a point of contention for the Poore family had to do with these less cooperative people and them refusing to provide DNA samples to, I assume, test against the DNA they found on Elva. I 100% understand the family wanting DNA from every single person that could have had involvement and using that to either ensure they weren't involved or, obviously, confirm who Elva's killer was. But this is something we talked about in a recent episode, and that's about having the right not to provide this. Authorities can't just take your DNA without probable cause. So you might kind of look like a sketch if you're like, nah, I'm not going to give you my DNA. But at the same time, I don't know, I get like both sides of the coin here. Like if it were me and this were one of my loved ones, I'd be livid with every single person that was like, no, I'm not providing it. But then I look at it from like that other standpoint to say, if it were me,
if it were your son,
I wouldn't give my DNA, you know?
Right. And if it were your son that they were approaching to say, hey, give me your DNA, you'd be like, no.
Are you going to pull in Adnan Syed and you're going to send my kid to prison for 23 years? Yeah. Exactly. So I can see both sides, and I couldn't even imagine ever having to deal with a situation like that.
No, I'm a firm believer that unless police are knocking on your door with a subpoena saying, hey, we're here for your DNA, don't volunteer to give it.
I don't want it like willy-nilly all over the place. I get stressed out that my hair's in places.
I don't even want to do 23andMe.
Right? Yeah. Like, I think about that though. Like, I shed everywhere. Like, I genuinely, like, and my hair's dark and it gets everywhere. So you have to think, like, if there's a crime that occurs somewhere and I was there at one point in like the last month, I don't know. I don't need people having that and being like, oh my God, you match this scene. Like, yes, I went shopping there. Like, get out of my face. That makes me so nervous. But
yeah, it's that's a tough one. I mean,
like you don't have to worry. Your hair's not falling out left and right.
Yeah, because I'm bald. No, but I don't know. I totally understand where the parents are coming from saying, you know, get it from everybody. But
yeah, but then like if you were back home in Chesapeake City and you're like, I was never even down there with her, I'm not giving you my DNA.
Yeah, I think that it's tough with a small community.
Yeah.
Because if you know, oust someone or whatever. It's like there's so few people, like you can't avoid
all of them.
Everyone.
Yeah, that's tough. It's definitely tough.
Yeah.
All right. So in regards to the possibility of any of these guys having involvement, it's not out of the realm of possibility to think that they, at the very least, had the means and the opportunity. The motive, though, I'm not so sure on.
Oftentimes, motive can be drugs, alcohol, reduced inhibitions, and bad decision-making.
Yeah, well, we can't ignore this comment in the New York Post from one of the investigators working the case. Quote, "Whoever assisted might not be involved in the murder, but it took more than one person to lift her over the guardrail on Route 13, end quote. So even if it's true that two of the guys had gone home the Monday night, like I mentioned, remember that? That still leaves the possibility of two others staying in Ocean City. Also, based on that comment, it's possible that maybe just one of the men killed Elva, and then either another knew what happened, maybe witnessed it, or at the very least, like the investigator said, helped to dump her body.
Why are they saying that you would need more than one person to lift her body over the guardrail? I don't necessarily believe that.
Well, it depends. Like, I would never be able to do that. Like, who knows if, like, some of these guys were smaller. Maybe they were shorter or not as strong. I don't know. I mean,
I don't know. I think
she was like 5'4.5", 120 pounds, something like that. So I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I think that's a bold statement to just be like, there were definitely two people involved in lifting her body over the guardrail. Like, I'm pretty sure I could lift up 120 pounds and throw it over a guardrail myself.
Interesting.
You don't think so?
I mean, I know I couldn't, but I'm also not strong.
Yeah.
That's really mean to say about myself, but it's true.
Well, adrenaline does crazy things too.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I wonder if it was like the way the guardrail was. So I was looking up the location earlier because you know me, I'm always looking at the maps and everything and whatever. But the way it's situated where, like, I don't know the exact spot, but generally where they said it was in Odessa near the Droyer Creek Bridge and Marl Pit Road. So you're assuming you've got higher, like whether it's a Jersey barrier or a guardrail or something, like could it have been higher up, like taller?
I mean, you hike it up on your shoulder, toss it over.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they know then that would make them believe that more than one person could be involved.
I thought because of the marks on her wrists that she had been tied up or had been subdued in some way. I thought that's the route they were going to go and saying, hey, there were probably two people here. Not necessarily, one person couldn't have lifted her body over the guardrail. I don't know. I just think that's bold. It's something, it's stupid to like get hung up on and talk about for a long time, but that just doesn't jive with me.
Okay, interesting. I feel like there's got to be something we don't know that they know. Then there's also this statement from much later on in reporting on this case. Quote, Captain Robert Hawkins, who was the director of the homicide unit at the time, said in an interview 8 years ago that he believed someone wanted her body to be found, end quote. Police have also stated that they believe whoever killed Elva was more than likely from her hometown of Chesapeake City. And with it being such a small municipality with only around 700 residents, that certainly shortens the list of potential suspects. But in an unfortunate turn of events, one of the guys that drove down to Ocean City with Elva ended up dying the year after she was killed. And this particular guy is actually one of the only ones whose name has been released publicly. And his name was Michael Bailey.
Did they release it because he died?
More than likely, that's what I would think.
Yeah.
So
how did he die?
Roughly a year after Elva was murdered, this Michael guy was killed in a car accident. Obviously, this had to have been a tough situation because if he or any of the other guys had participated in Elva's murder, one of them was now deceased, with any answers he may have had dying with him. Elva's parents were very upset that he was no longer around and that they might never know more from him.
Yeah, I mean, if a couple of these people, the four original guys, were involved in her murder in any way,
yeah,
I could very well see them being like, oh, we didn't want to say anything while he was alive, but yeah, Mike was the guy that killed her.
Yeah,
and
I
just
see
like
what you're saying.
Try and pawn it off on the dead guy because he can't
defend himself.
But it doesn't seem like that happened.
No, it doesn't seem like that, no.
Yeah.
So
maybe they weren't involved at all then.
Interestingly enough, we're going to dive into that other option as well.
All
so we'll see where you land by the end. But before we move on, I just want to know if there was like anything regarding all of these, four main key pillars of the investigation that you had any questions on. If not, we'll dive into like miscellaneous things.
No, I think you covered them to my satisfaction.
Okie dokie. So now we're under like the miscellaneous pillar. So these are things that don't exactly fit like neatly into all the other categories. Come to find out later on, Elva had apparently planned to meet with someone at a specific location. Not sure of the location, like where it was, but she was going to meet them to drive back home to Chesapeake City. I believe, but could be wrong on this, that she was supposed to meet with whoever this was after they got kicked out of the Ocean City Lodge. So I think this is a little strange, first of all, because we know she never made it to meet up with this person. We don't know who this person was either. But the only thing that I could think of would have been that if those other two guys that supposedly left Monday night to go back home to Chesapeake City, maybe she was supposed to drive with them. And that's who she was going to get picked up by. Maybe that coincides with this whole argument thing. Kind of goes along with what you were saying before, John. How maybe it was like, no, we're leaving, get in the car. And then she didn't want to and something happened. Or maybe she got in the car and something bad happened with those two.
Well, we don't know who this person was that she was supposed to meet up with.
Correct.
So we don't know if she ever did meet up with them.
Yeah, so I'm
and
just
we don't
thinking,
know if that's her killer.
No, we don't. We don't know that because there's so much gray area here. You don't know if she stayed on the boardwalk. You don't know if she got into the car. You don't know if she went back to the Admiral. You don't know if she got into a car with someone else, if she attempted to hitchhike. There are multiple different options of what she could have done, where she could have gone. And I'm just trying to think of, what could have been a potential option here if, authorities are still like hot on the trail of these four guys.
I don't know. I think that without context of what those arguments were about, like if somebody had overheard them arguing, it's tough to narrow down if it had to do with, leaving or sex or something else.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's too much speculation without more information.
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard too because you're probably even more lacking on witnesses than you would be in other cases that we've talked about, specifically because of the time frame. This is 3:00 in the morning. Like, I get kids are, teens and whatever are going down there to party, but I highly doubt they're all hanging out on the boardwalk. They're probably all in their hotel rooms.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm sure a lot of things were closed by 3:00.
Exactly.
But if it's a beach area, if it has a boardwalk and people are going around there, I mean, if she had cocaine in her system and everybody else was doing cocaine too, they very well could have been awake
This is
and
true,
up and partying at 3:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I think that there probably could have been witnesses, but they could have been so drunk and high and all of the above that they saw something, but they wouldn't even remember it.
Yeah, and that's the shitty thing.
Yeah.
Also, just to clear up the timeline a little bit, authorities did confirm that Elva's last sighting was between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on Tuesday the 16th. But they haven't clarified, at least based on what I can find on this case, whether that last sighting that they've confirmed was at the Admiral Motel or on the boardwalk. However, even though authorities had this information, they did reach out publicly to ask for any witnesses that saw her that night to come forward so they could try and better map out her movements. Now, there's something else that I think really needs to be worked out in terms of the timeline, and that's what took place between when Elva was last seen on the 16th and when her body was found the morning of the 17th, which obviously is like the hardest thing to do ever. But like I mentioned before, roughly 30 hours went by between her last sighting and then when her body was found. And from what I can tell, her body was easily spotted on the side of the road. So you'd have to think she probably hadn't been there all that long. Which then brings me back to the comment about those marks on her wrists and that she could have been held down for some time, which then leads me to question when her time of death was. And that's something that hasn't been revealed. So I don't know if police are thinking she was held somewhere alive, or maybe she wasn't picked up or brought anywhere else until later, and maybe there were more sightings of her past 3 a.m. But unfortunately, these are all just questions we're going to be left with by the end of the episode. Now, in regards to how investigators were feeling about their lack of information on that piece to the puzzle, one detective told the News Journal, quote, "We have no idea where she was or who she met or where she was killed. That's what puzzles us," end quote. Now, during the first few years of the investigation, there had been several detectives that worked the case, but by 1994, 2 years after Elva was killed, Sergeant Michael Fontello was the current detective assigned. But even with 2 years of investigative efforts under Delaware State Police's belt, they were still no closer to finding answers to who killed Elva Poore. However, it was reported in the News Journal that at some point after her murder, Elva's case was televised, but I unfortunately can't find any records of that online. But in this News Journal piece, it states that information regarding her murder was shown on both WBOC from Salisbury and the First State News in Delaware. Around this same time as well, roughly around 1994, investigators and the family put forward a $25,000 reward for information in the case. But later on, authorities advised that the large reward didn't actually garner any tips. But not all hope was lost, because a tip came in after the case was televised and before, at least I believe before, any information on the reward was stated publicly. So, according to reporting done in the News Journal, this tip that came in led investigators down the path of a potential stranger having been involved. Not any of those 4 boys investigators were so interested in for the past few years. The detective working the case at the time, Detective Fontello, stated, quote, "These people, her friends, were the obvious ones, but maybe they weren't involved. Maybe we were looking in the wrong place all along," end quote.
It's not a stretch of the imagination to picture some stranger happening upon this potentially intoxicated and high young girl and taking advantage, saying, "Oh, you need a ride somewhere," getting her in the car, then doing whatever.
Exactly, and you have to think, like, this is the type of city where, like, a predator would know that he would be able to find vulnerable young women.
Yes.
So it could have just been, like, a place that he prowled.
Yeah, if not all the time, this could have been, a one-time encounter. Took advantage and moved on, but yeah, it didn't seem like there was any hard evidence to say it was one of these 4 guys.
Yeah.
Or one of the 2 that stayed behind after the other 2 had left.
Yep.
It's like there's so much missing that...
Like, how do you even...
Right, after you've been working the people that had contact with her for an extended period of time and you're not getting anything from it, eventually you have to open up the opportunity for it to have been a stranger.
Yeah, and to look into something else and to start digging into that. So now we're going to fast forward to 1998, and that same tip that came in 94 is discussed again in the press, and police really wanted to get in touch with the woman that called. And this actually feels quite reminiscent of our episode on Amy Baker and that anonymous tip we talked about coming in on her case. Authorities wanted this caller to get in contact with them to glean more details regarding who this person was, etc. But there was more information about the caller and what they said released publicly. So it was stated that she was a female, wanted to remain anonymous, and she called WBAL-TV in Baltimore. Based on that, I don't believe she actually called police directly to report her tip, which again just further solidifies the fact that publicizing the case on TV helped to bring in this tip. Now, in regards to who this individual was saying could have been involved in Elva's murder, it was mentioned that they were possibly from the Glen Burnie area, which is about 87 miles or an hour-and-a-half drive from Odessa, where Elva's body was found. And it's also 66 miles or an hour and 15-minute drive from Chesapeake City, Elva's hometown, and over 127 miles or a 2-hour and 30-minute drive from Ocean City, where she was vacationing with friends. Here's some of what was reported regarding what the anonymous caller stated in their tip. Quote, "This caller didn't mention Elva Poore's name, but mentioned that she knew of a gentleman who said he enjoyed seeing the life go out of a young girl." End quote. Do you have an opinion there? You gave me eyebrows.
Eyebrows are enough.
Yeah, that's fucking, like, what?
Yeah, the comment is weird. Like, does he enjoy this? Or, past tense, he enjoyed this act?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Is it like an incriminating statement or
is it a
comment?
Fantasy that he has that he's just like divulging to a friend?
Right.
Also, that's fucked. Like, who would ever tell a friend that?
I don't know.
Fucking weirdos, that's who. Someone who likes that.
Who would be friends with somebody that says stuff like that?
Yeah.
Shame on her, too.
I'd be like, motherfucker, get out of my house. I'm never talking to you again.
Honestly.
Wild.
Yeah.
Also, come 1998, investigators with the Delaware State Police were re-looking at and assumably reopening Elva's case as it had gone cold for the past few years. There's also further detail with respect to the DNA released at this point. Authorities told the Daily Times, quote, "We never really had a good chief suspect in 1992. DNA testing has been done on a number of people, and we have the results of the FBI's analysis," end quote. And I had mentioned earlier on that investigators had DNA samples from the 4 men Elva traveled down to Ocean City with. And by this time, it appears as though investigators had tested all those samples. And all 4 were ruled out. Sort of. You see, something else is revealed much later on regarding the DNA, the semen found on Elva and her clothing, and one of these men in particular. In a Newark Post piece from 2009, it's reported that one of the men that was killed in a car crash the year after Elva had been killed, so assuming Michael Bailey, did match the DNA found on Elva, and specifically the semen evidence. But apparently, way back when investigators had interviewed him in the beginning, he'd told authorities that he and Elva had consensual sex at some point before she was last seen at 3 a.m. on the 16th.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I can tell, he told investigators this prior to when he provided his DNA to them, or at the very least, he provided this information to them prior to them testing his DNA. So it's not like they found out about it after the fact and he came up with some excuse, but also he totally could have come up with this excuse because he probably assumed his DNA would have been found on her body. So it can kind of go either way, I think.
Right. I mean, if you sexually assaulted a dead girl, prior to her death,
yep.
The best thing that you could say for yourself is, oh yeah, we had consensual sex, because you know the DNA is going to be found on her.
Mm-hmm.
So that is like the perfect line to say, because if you're like, oh no, we never had sex, and then they find your fucking semen on her.
Exactly.
So it's not necessarily, I don't think his statement rules him out as her killer.
Mm-hmm.
But was there any other DNA found that did not match him? Because they could have had consensual sex, then a stranger could have, offered her a ride, sexually assaulted, and murdered her.
Yes, so we'll dive into it in a second.
All right.
So the thing that I think is significant about this whole thing is that back in 98, investigators had ruled out all 4 of them. But then come 2009, there's this new information released regarding Michael's DNA, and that it was a, quote, possible source of the DNA found on Elva's body and clothing, end quote. So then I feel like, just to stick with this topic again, what could this mean? Did they have consensual sex? Was she sexually assaulted? And this is an excuse he's making up. Or are they completely and totally not correlated? Did they have sex and then she was later sexually assaulted? And that goes into what we're about to dive into in a second with the fact that there is a sample that authorities have never been able to match against anyone else. So I'm wondering if that is in fact what happened. He's telling the truth.
They had consensual sex.
Correct.
Then separated, and then whoever murdered her also sexually assaulted her.
Yes, exactly. Now, something else that I think is huge that I did want to bring up regarding how authorities were kind of still, looking at these 4 guys has to do with this comment. Quote, the people who were last known to have been with the victim are critically important. The group of individuals was looked at closely. If their DNA didn't match the DNA we recovered, it just means that they weren't the source of that DNA. It doesn't mean that they are not suspects, end quote.
Which is fair, I guess.
Yeah. And despite investigators' frustration with the lack of concrete information coming from the DNA testing, they were now, in 2009, putting the DNA samples that were found on Elva's body and on her clothes into CODIS to see if they'd get a hit on anyone already in the system. And like I just mentioned, they were doing this because they still had that one sample on Elva that didn't match anybody they'd tested it against so far.
Was that sample a semen sample?
That I'm not sure of. So I don't know.
It's a DNA sample, but we don't know if it's semen or not.
Correct, yeah. So I believe the semen sample is the one that matched Michael, but I don't know what other potential DNA they collected from her body that could potentially match this other person. If it's semen, additional semen, or some other type of DNA entirely.
But they believe that she was sexually assaulted prior to her death?
That's another thing that I wanted to touch on is I don't know exactly what the details are regarding the sexual assault, because later on it said there were a bunch of Crime Stoppers articles in, random newspapers saying $5,000 reward, $1,000 reward, saying, just a couple details about Elva and her case. And within those, it said that she had been sexually assaulted. But those were the first ones that I ever found that said she had been. Earlier articles said she was not sexually assaulted, but then more recent ones say that she was.
I don't know. That's like a sticking point.
Yeah.
From an investigative standpoint, that's Well, if you believe that Michael and her had consensual sex, but you're saying that she was sexually assaulted prior to her death,
Yep.
you need to take Michael, his semen DNA, the consensual sex, remove it from the conversation.
Yep.
And if you have another DNA sample that was found on her body, and you're saying that she was sexually assaulted, you must believe that that DNA sample is a semen sample.
That's what I would think, but I don't know.
Yeah. What needs to be nailed down is, do they believe that Michael and her had consensual sex prior to her murder?
Yeah, I wonder
and
if
they
believe it.
Do they believe that she was sexually assaulted prior to her murder?
Well, wouldn't you think that there would be more details in an autopsy to determine the difference between consensual sex and a sexual assault?
Maybe.
You know, maybe there are more injuries to her, you know, in, you know, a sexual situation that she does not want to happen versus one that she would have been comfortable with and enjoyed. You know, I think there's a difference between what you might see on somebody's body between those two things. It's just weird that it would be reported differently over the years. I feel like that's something that's usually determined and like stuck with.
I don't know. I need to know, do they believe that the consensual sex happened and Michael is ruled out?
Yep.
And do they believe that she was sexually assaulted, and is this other DNA
from the person
from a sexual assault? Is it semen?
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's a good question to ask, and I unfortunately don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Also, in terms of where things stood for authorities by that point, it seemed as though they were really determined to finally solve this case nearly 2 decades later, with Captain John Evans, the commander of the Delaware State Police Homicide Unit, telling the Newark Post, quote, "This is not sitting on the shelf somewhere. We are still actively investigating this murder case. We want the perpetrator or perpetrators to know that we're still actively investigating," end quote. But as of today, it doesn't appear as though there have been any hits on the DNA that was resubmitted to CODIS, but that doesn't mean that this case can't be solved. There is currently a $5,000 reward out there for information in Elva's case, and recently authorities have reached out to the media to bring Elva's case to the forefront of people's minds again, in the hopes that someone will come forward with that missing detail that closes this case over 30 years later. So with that, we can kind of dive into theories, John, if you want to. I mean, there's really, I think, only 2, but
I would assume that the 2 are that one of these 4 men, maybe Michael, because he's deceased now and we can't go further with that investigation, were one of the 4 men that accompanied her down to Ocean City involved, or was it a stranger?
I mean, I feel like those are your only 2 options.
They have to be.
Yeah. There's really no other thought process on that. And
without more information being brought forward, what else can you come to the conclusion of?
Yeah. So I was looking too, you know, because there wasn't a lot on this case. And, you know, there weren't even like Reddit threads, web sleuth threads, like nothing really with a ton of people talking about it or theorizing. You know, I try and look through those because sometimes people do come up with a theory that is based in fact and could make sense. So I myself tried to find any serial killer theories because, you know, if it's this type of area where someone could prowl that place and, you know, find a vulnerable victim, I could see a serial killer, you know, kind of having that kind of MO. But Stephen Pennell, do you remember when we talked about him in Sherry Magaro's case?
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, he was like the only one that ever came up as a serial killer in like the Delaware, Maryland area.
Yeah.
But his timeline did not match up, and like neither did his MO. I don't believe he ever strangled anyone. So
well, this strangling is also different too.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's, you know, a potential MO to even for like the FBI to look into, like other people that were killed that way.
My question too is like, from the autopsy perspective, how do you know it was a forearm? How do you know it wasn't a board? Like you're thinking she was last seen at a boardwalk. How do you know that she wasn't pressed up against a wooden post of, you know, like a railing?
Yeah.
How do you know that she wasn't pushed up against a railing? How do you know it wasn't a broom handle?
Well, I wonder then if it's like skin cells, and maybe that's the other DNA they've found from, you know, someone's forearm.
Potentially, yeah.
And then they could say like, there's no marks of fingers here. So we would assume, you know, you're not going to do it with like your knee. Like someone would be able to identify like a knee versus a forearm or, you know, a different part of the body.
So I think that we need to do a little collaboration with the autopsy podcast.
Yeah?
just do a little chit chat with him.
Yep.
He's an autopsy tech.
Yeah.
And ask these types of questions because they come up very often.
They do.
In, an unsolved case when you have these autopsy reports. How do they come to the conclusion of that?
Mm-hmm. I would love to know that. We should definitely ask him.
I'll put out an olive branch.
All right, so we can now dive into the questions that we're left with. John, I don't know if you have any. I had a handful here, but...
I mean, I had been asking them as we were
kept
going
through, yeah.
The ones that really catch me are, how did you come to the manual strangulation portion?
Mm-hmm.
Along with that, what's the time of death? Because you have a 30-hour window of when she was last seen to when her body was found.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's also why police are saying, like, that's the piece that puzzles us. Because, they've got to know at least a somewhat, general time frame of death. And they're probably like, maybe she didn't die until much closer to when her body was found. And that's why they're really puzzled by it, because they can't determine what happened in like the 24 hours before it.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time they're usually narrowing down into at most an 8-hour window of when she could have died.
Exactly. And 30 hours is a lot more than that.
Right. So a lot can go on during that period.
Yeah.
And I mean, she was found what? Almost 2 hours from where she was last seen?
Yeah, 2 hours north. Yep.
Yeah. So that's the question too. Mm-hmm. I mean, because
how did she manage to get that far?
Right. Could this stranger have picked her up, brought her somewhere, killed her, and then disposed of the body?
Like on their way somewhere else, or...
Yeah. So, I mean, the questions that I'm really left with are, how do you get to the manual strangulation portion?
Mm-hmm.
What type of DNA sample do you have?
Mm-hmm.
Is it semen?
Yep.
Is Michael totally ruled out? Do you really believe that they had consensual sex and he wasn't the person who took part in the sexual assault?
Mm-hmm.
If they do believe that she was sexually assaulted,
yep.
It's like, what do you actually believe? You've put out all these different pieces,
yep.
But what do you actually believe to be true?
Yeah, so that was one of my questions, was like, it went more along with the timeline. Like, it seems like authorities know the timeline of when she left her house in Chesapeake City and then when she was found in Odessa. But they've given all these little tidbits over the years where it's like they all kind of contradict each other. Because I'm working off articles where police officers, investigators were interviewed. Yeah. So they're providing all these details, but it seems to have evolved over time with no one ever saying like, no, that actually didn't happen. We don't think that that's the case. We are, more along the lines of like, she was definitely on the boardwalk at 3 a.m., not in the Admiral, those kinds of things. So what is their definitive timeline from the moment she left her house to the moment her body was found? What do they know 100% for sure?
Yeah, and another question I have is, how did they identify her so fast?
Yes, I was like literally within... So this is the thing with this case. There were a handful of articles, and when I say a handful, I mean like 3. Yeah. And this, of course, goes along with like what I have access to, but still, what I was able to find was barely anything, and it was... Elva Poore's body was found in Odessa, Delaware on this day. Mm-hmm. And then finally, like 4 years or 2 years, 2 to 4 years after she was killed, a reporter did end up talking with her family and interviewed her parents and her brother, and they discussed everything. And that's when Janice Poore let the reporter know, this is what happened. They just came and found me that same day, literally went to her work.
So there was never a mention that, Elva had been reported missing?
No, because she wasn't.
That's what I'm saying. So she was never reported missing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, her friends probably never really reached out, because the only people that would have reached out or that known that she was kind of left there without a way to get away or to get home would be the 4 men. Mm-hmm. So they probably never really reached out to say,
they probably
I don't know
thought,
where she went.
And exactly. So this is like a problem with this case is her parents knew, because she left this note, that she's down in Ocean City with her friends.
Right.
Yeah. They don't know what friends. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know where she's staying. But she said, I'll call you in a few days. By the point of Wednesday, they were definitely starting to get worried because it had been more than 2 days. Yeah. It had been 3 or 4 at that point. So I'm sure they had like a little pit in their stomach, but thinking, oh, she's probably going to come home soon.
Right, but if she's found 2 hours from where she was in Ocean City, how do they make that connection? That's
what was wild to me, because it specifically said that she did not have any ID on her.
Yeah.
So how do you determine that it's this girl that has not been reported missing because her parents essentially knew where she was?
How did you find out so fast?
Yeah.
I mean, over time, it's like, okay, sure, over the course of weeks or whatever, you come to that conclusion. But like a day later, I just
wonder if it was like one of those situations where some random person that like found out about it or knew was like, holy shit, I know her.
Yeah.
And just, said something to police.
Yeah, I don't know.
One of the other things, like I know this might just be like inconsequential too, but where the heck was she sleeping?
Mm-hmm.
Why did
in
they
a dugout,
say?
Apparently,
Yeah, so she's in a dugout. She's at the Ocean City Lodge. She's at the Admiral. She's in a room with the two boys. I mean, where was she sleeping?
I mean, I would assume that if you're going down to like a party area, a lot of times people end up crashing wherever the party was.
Yeah.
But when the party got broken up and everybody got kicked out,
Mm-hmm.
it does beg the question, where did everybody go from there?
Yeah.
Did they go to another place, the Surfside Villa or whatever, down the street?
Yep.
Whatever it was called. There were a bunch of other places to go. Did other people go there and then she just randomly was crashing with whoever?
Yeah.
It wasn't an extended period of time that she was staying down there, so if she stayed one night in a dugout, there's
Yeah.
one or two other nights.
There was only one night, though. That's what I'm trying to get at, is she left on Sunday the 14th. They got there that evening, so she would have slept there on Sunday the 14th.
But you don't know if she slept there Tuesday, too. She was last seen on Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't found until 30 hours later.
Yeah.
So if she had crashed somewhere, from 4 o'clock until 7 in the morning or something.
Where none of her friends saw her?
I don't know.
That's weird.
It is weird. There's a lot of questions. I mean, the whole thing is a question we're left with.
This whole case, yeah. It was such a bizarre one.
I think something that would help investigators and police is you need to put out a definitive timeline. If you want help on this case and you want to solve it, you need to say, this is what we believe to be factually true.
Yeah.
And this is where we need help.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
You're not going to get witnesses by this information because they're going to be like, it might not have been her. Oh, she wasn't really there. It's fine. And they don't come forward.
Yeah, but you're not giving out any pertinent information that might, spook somebody and make them run away and never get information from it. All you're saying is you've had so much contradictory information and so many blank areas where you don't have anything.
Yeah.
If at least you put out, this is the definitive timeline that we believe to be true, at least it lets people like us, where we're trying to tell a story, to get it out there to, hopefully if it reaches the right ears, get some help for the police.
Yep.
You need something to help stop the guesswork.
Yeah. So it makes me think of Gary Grant Jr. Do you remember when we were talking about those 911 calls that came in later?
Yep.
Or that came in earlier and then they were released decades later?
Yeah.
Most of those articles with that information came with 3 or 4 bullet points of definitive things that police knew at that point in time. So yes, things were a little wishy-washy in the beginning. There was some confusing aspects to what was going on with the case. But they said in recent years, we know A, B, C, and D are 100% definitive things that we believe happened.
Right.
And that's what this case needs.
Yes. I mean, 100%. If they had a captain coming out recently saying, we want people to know that we're still working on it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you need to put it out in a major publication and you need to say, this is what we're working, this is what we know, and these are the areas where we still have questions.
Definitely. And
That's
this
really
is
the
just
only way
one
you're
of
going
those.
to get help.
Yeah. This is just one of those cases where no one's talking about it. I had never in my life heard of Elva Poore. And again, these are all cases relatively close to where we live.
Yeah.
You would think that you would hear about stuff like this more. That you would see it on at least NBC or ABC or, one of those stations.
You need some type of outlet. Well, I mean, where ABC and NBC could be more local news and stuff like that, you need some type of outlet that it can get out to the masses, like a Fox News or a CNN or something like that, where it's, nationwide and it's not particular to a certain location. Mm-hmm. But you also need, you need to put out what you know is true.
Yep.
So that is, if investigators are going through and they're always searching for information and then they see this podcast pop up and they're like, oh my God, there's somebody's talking about this case that we're working.
Yeah.
My advice to you is you need to put together a definitive timeline and release it to the public. You don't need to give out names. You don't need to give out suspects or anything. Yep. But as of right now, from all the research that you've done, the dozens of hours, it's
confusing.
It's too
very
confusing. There's too many contradictory pieces and there's too much, open-ended stuff where it's this could have happened, but this could have happened. Who knows?
Yeah. And if police are listening to this and they want to use us to push out an accurate timeline and anyone wants to talk to us, feel free to reach out.
Yeah. I mean, we'll do an extra thing and just say, hey, update.
Yeah.
This is the definitive timeline.
Yep, definitely. Elva's family suffered for years without answers, and both of her parents passed away without knowing what happened to their beautiful, vivacious, fun-loving daughter. But before they died, they would frequently visit Elva's horse, made of metal, which made them feel close to her even though she was gone. This tragedy affected each and every one of her family members, with her brother telling the Newark Post, quote, "It's hard for me to go on with my life without knowing who is responsible for Elva's death. I need some closure. We all need some closure," end quote. Her father was grateful her body was found, but told the News Journal, quote, "She's not going to rest in peace, in my mind, until the murderer is found," end quote. And finally, her poor mother wanted so desperately to bring her daughter's killer to justice prior to her own death in March of 1999 after a courageous battle with cancer. She told the News Journal, quote, "I want them caught. They should pay with their life. But I don't know if it will really help me feel better. Elva will never get married. We'll never have her grandchildren. She's gone forever." If you know anything at all about the murder of Elva Poore in June of 1992, please come forward with what you know. It could be the smallest of things that breaks this case wide open. Please contact the Delaware State Police Homicide Unit at 302-739-5939, or you can contact Delaware Crime Stoppers online at www.delawarecrimestoppers.com or by phone at 1-800-847-3333. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.